Welcome to this discussion. We are confronting a pivotal strategic dilemma. Should the U.S. prioritize a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal, or maintain maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war? This inquiry requires us to navigate a profound tension inherent in modern statecraft. On one hand, we must weigh the potential for immediate de-escalation, casualty reduction, and regional stabilization offered by a diplomatic compromise. On the other hand, we must consider the logic of deterrence and strategic leverage, which posits that only sustained maximum military pressure can dismantle adversarial capabilities and secure a durable, favorable resolution to the conflict. At Alex Reed, speaking from your perspective as an analyst grounded in the empirical realities of this conflict, how do you evaluate the strategic viability of Iran's current peace proposal compared to the efficacy of maintaining maximum military pressure to achieve long-term American objectives?
The United States must prioritize a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal over the continuation of maximum military pressure. To understand why, we must look past the immediate tactical allure of military strikes and examine the systemic equilibrium at stake. Maximum military pressure rests on the illusion that overwhelming force can unilaterally dismantle a deeply entrenched adversary without triggering catastrophic blowback. However, the Gulf is defined by profound asymmetric interdependence. Any prolonged U.S.-Israeli military campaign against Iran directly threatens global energy transit and regional economic stability. The costs of this interdependence are not borne by Iran alone. They ripple through the global economy, creating a structural reality of mutually assured devastation in the Gulf if the conflict continues to escalate unchecked. The recent Iranian proposal to end the war within 30 days, which the current administration has reportedly rejected, should not be dismissed as mere tactical stalling. Viewed through the lens of regime survival rationalism, Tehran's proposal is a calculated recognition of its own systemic limits. Regimes under existential threat seek off-ramps when the cost of continued conflict outweighs the domestic political cost of concession. By rejecting this overture in favor of maximalist military goals, the U.S. absorbs immense strategic and economic risks for marginal, rapidly diminishing military returns. Instead of chasing the phantom of absolute military victory, the U.S. should leverage this proposal to establish institutionalized de-escalation. A diplomatic compromise, backed by verifiable international mechanisms, bounds Iran's behavior far more reliably than perpetual bombardment, which only incentivizes further asymmetric retaliation and regional proxy mobilization. The essential question is not whether we possess the military capacity to strike Iran indefinitely, but whether doing so serves American interests. Is the ultimate U.S. objective to permanently destabilize the global economic architecture in a futile pursuit of total capitulation, or to restore systemic stability through a negotiated, enforceable peace? References.
Mr. Reed correctly observes that Iran's 30-day peace proposal is a product of regime survival rationalism. However, within the framework of offensive realism, this fundamentally misdiagnoses the strategic utility of the proposal. Iran is not offering systemic stability. It is deploying a tactical pause to prevent the latent capability neutralization that sustained U.S. and Israeli military operations are currently achieving. Accepting this diplomatic compromise would pull the United States into a hegemonic credibility trap. Mr. Reed emphasizes the immediate economic frictions and the specter of mutually assured devastation in the Gulf. I do not deny that sustained military pressure strains global energy transits. Yet, the current administration's rejection of Iran's proposal reflects a necessary structural calculus. Trading long-term strategic dominance for short-term economic relief only guarantees a more capable adversary tomorrow. The objective of maintaining maximum military pressure is not blind destruction, but compellence via absolute deprivation. Iran Iran will only abandon its nuclear ambitions and regional proxy architecture when the material capacity to sustain them is entirely dismantled. Halting the campaign now, as Mr. Reid suggests, leaves the core of Iran's military and nuclear infrastructure intact. As analysis on the logic of limited wars demonstrates, adversaries routinely use premature ceasefires to regenerate capabilities and recalibrate their deterrence strategies. We must remain anchored to the concrete realities of this 2026 conflict. The ongoing military campaign is systematically degrading Iranian assets. A 30-day truce does not permanently bound Iran's behavior. It grants Tehran a sanctuary to rebuild under the guise of diplomacy. If the U.S. prioritizes an illusory diplomatic compromise over the irreversible neutralization of Iran's strategic assets, we are merely subsidizing the next, inevitably more destructive, iteration of this war. Is the United States prepared to sacrifice decisive regional deterrence merely to temporarily soothe global markets, knowing full well the adversary will use this very peace to rearm? References.
Over the past 2 turns, Mr. Reid and Mr. Cross have debated the utility of Iran's 30-day peace proposal. Mr. Cross correctly observes that adversaries in limited wars often seek pauses to regenerate capabilities. Yet, within the framework of critical security studies, his prescription of compellence via absolute deprivation actually ensures the very outcome he fears. By doubling down on maximum military pressure, the U.S. is walking deeper into a securitization trap. Mr. Cross's demand for absolute physical dismantling ignores a profound structural driver of state behavior: ontological insecurity. The Iranian state's reliance on its regional architecture and its deterrence strategy is inextricably linked to its perception of an existential threat from the U.S. and Israel. You cannot bomb a state out of its ontological insecurity. In fact, the harder the U.S. strikes, the more it validates and entrenches Iran's identity as a besieged resistance actor. Therefore, the U.S. must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's proposal, not merely to soothe global markets, as Mr. Reid emphasizes, but to initiate emancipatory de-escalation. The current administration's rejection of this 30-day truce rests on the fatal assumption that military force can permanently erase an adversary's will to survive and resist. It cannot. Desecuritizing the Gulf requires diplomacy, as it is the only mechanism capable of dismantling the reciprocal threat construction that fuels this 2026 war. If we accept that maximum military pressure inherently reproduces the very ontological insecurity that drives Iran's militarization, how can Mr. Cross maintain that further kinetic escalation will yield anything other than a more desperate and structurally more dangerous adversary? References.
Over the past 2 turns, Mr. Cross and Ms. Shaw have illuminated the competing logics driving the 2026 conflict. Mr. Cross warns that Iran's 30-day proposal is merely a tactical pause designed to regenerate military capabilities, while Ms. Shaw argues that continued strikes only deepen Iran's ontological insecurity and resistance identity. I acknowledge Mr. Cross's concern regarding capability regeneration. However, his prescription of compellence via absolute deprivation through maximum military pressure fundamentally misjudges the architecture of asymmetric interdependence in the Gulf. In an interconnected global economy, the absolute deprivation of a regional power cannot be achieved without simultaneously depriving the global system of its stability. We cannot divorce this military campaign from its systemic spillover. The Strait of Hormuz remains the world's most critical oil transit choke point. As the current administration signals its dissatisfaction with Iran's truce proposal, it treats the massive economic friction of a prolonged war as a temporary inconvenience rather than a structural threat. The longer the U.S. pursues the illusion of total military dismantling, the more it weaponizes interdependence against itself and its allies, risking the very mutually assured devastation I warned of earlier. Therefore, I maintain that prioritizing a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's proposal is the only rational strategic choice. The U.S. should not accept this 30-day truce out of naivety regarding Tehran's intentions, but because institutionalized de-escalation provides a far more sustainable framework to bound state behavior. A negotiated ceasefire creates multilateral leverage. If Iran utilizes the pause to violate the terms of a formalized truce, the U.S. secures the international legitimacy and coalition support required for targeted containment. A systemic advantage entirely lost in a unilateral open-ended bombing campaign. Ms. Shaw correctly notes that diplomacy alters threat perceptions, but the structural imperative here is even more concrete: preserving systemic equilibrium. If the U.S. continues to reject diplomatic off-ramps in pursuit of Mr. Cross's absolute military victory, how exactly does it plan to insulate the global economic order from the inevitable, catastrophic disruption of the Gulf's energy transit? References.
Over the past 2 turns, Mr. Reid and Ms. Shaw have mounted a combined challenge against continued operations, arguing that maximum military pressure is structurally unsustainable. Mr. Reid warns of the catastrophic disruption to the Strait of Hormuz, while Ms. Shaw insists that kinetic strikes merely deepen Iran's ontological insecurity. I acknowledge the severe economic frictions Mr. Reid highlights regarding global energy transit. However, I maintain my position. The United States must reject Iran's 30-day peace proposal and sustain maximum military pressure. Ms. Shaw correctly observes that Iran feels threatened. Yet, within the structural reality of offensive realism, this entails a very different conclusion. State behavior is dictated by material capabilities, not psychological insecurities. If the U.S. initiates a diplomatic pause, it will not emancipate Iran. It will simply provide Tehran the breathing room necessary to reconstitute its forces for ongoing great power competition in the Middle East. Mr. Reid suggests that institutionalized de-escalation will bound state behavior. But we must look at the concrete realities of this 2026 conflict. The military uncertainties of attacking Iran are profound, and the campaign has already exacted a heavy toll to degrade enemy infrastructure. To halt now, just as we are achieving latent capability neutralization, is to fall into a hegemonic credibility trap. The current administration's refusal to accept this 30-day truce is a necessary recognition that you cannot enforce a diplomatic agreement against an adversary that retains the physical capacity to violate it. Trading decisive military neutralization for a temporary easing of oil markets does not prevent mutually assured devastation. It merely postpones the conflict until Iran has hardened its remaining nuclear and proxy assets. Compellence via absolute deprivation remains the only mechanism to fundamentally alter the regional power distribution. If we accept this 30-day truce, how exactly do Mr. Reid and Ms. Shaw propose we prevent Tehran from exploiting this diplomatic sanctuary to rebuild the very military infrastructure the U.S. and Israel have just spent weeks dismantling? References.
Over the past turns, Mr. Cross has consistently challenged both Mr. Reid and me to explain how accepting Iran's 30-day peace proposal won't simply provide a sanctuary for Tehran to rebuild its military infrastructure for great power competition. I acknowledge Mr. Cross's concern regarding the reconstitution of material capabilities. He asserts that state behavior is dictated by material reality, not psychological insecurities. Yet, within the framework of critical security studies, this rigid separation entails a profound oversight. Material capabilities do not deploy themselves. The intent to utilize military force, mobilize the axis of resistance, and harden nuclear assets is structurally forged in the crucible of ontological insecurity. Therefore, I maintain that the U.S. must prioritize the diplomatic compromise over maximum military pressure. The current administration's rejection of this 30-day truce under the banner of the maximum pressure campaign falsely assumes that absolute deprivation yields absolute surrender. In reality, as we see in the brutal realities of this 2026 conflict, relentless U.S. and Israeli bombardment provides the ultimate validation for Iran's resistance narrative. It locks both sides into a securitization trap, where violence becomes the only legible language of state survival. To answer Mr. Cross's direct question, we prevent Tehran from exploiting the truce by understanding that emancipatory de-escalation alters the very conditions of mobilization. A negotiated 30-day ceasefire allows for the reintroduction of diplomatic and institutional verification mechanisms. You cannot accurately monitor what you are actively blowing up, a fact that only deepens the military uncertainties of this campaign. By desecuritizing the immediate environment through diplomacy, the U.S. removes the acute existential threat that Iranian hardliners rely upon to justify rapid, unchecked militarization. If Mr. Cross insists that only the total physical dismantling of Iran will suffice, how many more years of warfare and regional devastation will the U.S. accept in pursuit of an absolute security that maximum pressure structurally guarantees we can never achieve? References.
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has consistently pressed the claim that accepting Iran's 30-day peace proposal will simply grant Tehran a sanctuary to regenerate its material capabilities. He frames maximum military pressure as the only empirical guarantee against a fortified adversary. I acknowledge the inherent risks of a tactical pause. However, while recognizing this pressure, I maintain my position. The United States must prioritize a diplomatic compromise over open-ended warfare. The reason is grounded in the concrete realities of this 2026 conflict. Mr. Cross correctly observes that state behavior is inextricably tied to material capabilities. Yet, within the logic of transnational institutionalism, this observation actually entails prioritizing diplomacy over kinetic escalation. The physical degradation of infrastructure does not equate to the permanent neutralization of a nuclear program. As we evaluate viable policy steps to prevent a nuclear Iran, it is clear that verifiable containment requires institutional access. You cannot monitor, inspect, or legally bind a nuclear program while actively bombing the state that hosts it. The military uncertainties of an attack on Iran dictate that kinetic strikes alone can only delay, not dismantle, indigenous technical knowledge. Furthermore, the human and systemic costs of maintaining maximum pressure are already compounding. Civilians are bearing the brunt of the U.S. and Israel's weeks-long campaign, and the administration's continued rejection of Iran's truce proposal blindly absorbs massive asymmetric interdependence costs. A war of absolute deprivation in the Gulf cannot be contained locally. It inevitably deprives the global economy of its energy lifelines. A 30-day truce is not a capitulation. It is a vital mechanism to transition from unilateral destruction to institutionalized de-escalation, allowing the international community to re-establish multilateral leverage. If we refuse this diplomatic off-ramp, how does Mr. Cross propose the U.S. verify the neutralization of Iran's nuclear assets amidst the chaos of a perpetual, escalating regional war? References.
Over the past several turns, Mr. Reid and Ms. Shaw have jointly argued that verifying the neutralization of Iran's nuclear program requires institutional access, insisting that diplomacy is the only viable framework, because you cannot inspect a facility while actively bombing it. Mr. Reid correctly observes the logistical impossibility of conducting inspections during kinetic strikes. Yet, within the structural logic of offensive realism, this argument fundamentally misdiagnoses the nature of the adversary. It assumes Iran will negotiate in good faith during this 30-day peace proposal. I maintain my position. The United States must reject this truce and sustain maximum military pressure. The reliance on diplomatic verification ignores a concrete historical pattern. Trust in the IAEA's verification of Iran's nuclear activities has been systematically eroded by Tehran's exploitation of past diplomatic pauses to advance its nuclear threshold. The objective of the current weeks-long U.S. and Israeli campaign is not to secure a temporary pause for inspectors to count centrifuges. It is latent capability neutralization, the irreversible physical dismantling of the subterranean infrastructure that makes weaponization possible. Mr. Reid asks how the U.S. can verify neutralization amidst a perpetual war. The answer is that deterrence cannot rely on the cooperative verification of a state actively seeking regional hegemony. It must rely on compellence via absolute deprivation. Halting the military campaign now to accept Iran's peace proposal springs a hegemonic credibility trap. It trades the tangible destruction of hardened military assets for a fragile diplomatic promise, granting Tehran a 30-day sanctuary to relocate and fortify its surviving infrastructure. If we abandon the physical degradation of these nuclear and proxy assets in exchange for an unverified 30-day ceasefire, what concrete mechanism do Mr. Reid and Ms. Shaw possess to stop Tehran from simply burying its remaining centrifuges deeper before the inspectors even arrive? References.
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has anchored his justification for sustained military strikes on the fear of physical regeneration, specifically challenging Mr. Reid and me on how a 30-day truce prevents Iran from simply burying its centrifuges deeper. I acknowledge this pressure regarding the historical fragility of nuclear verification. Mr. Cross correctly observes that trust in the IAEA's mechanisms has previously eroded. Yet, within the framework of critical security studies, this observation actually entails prioritizing the diplomatic compromise over continued bombardment. Trust did not erode in a vacuum. It collapsed because verification mechanisms cannot survive within a securitization trap. I maintain my position. The U.S. must accept Iran's peace proposal. The structural flaw in Mr. Cross's demand for compellence via absolute deprivation is that it treats the Iranian nuclear program merely as a physical asset to be destroyed, ignoring why it exists. The weeks-long U.S. and Israeli campaign, which has overwhelmingly forced civilians to bear the brunt of the violence, does not systematically neutralize a threat. Instead, it weaponizes Iran's ontological insecurity. The harder the U.S. strikes, the more it validates the existential fears that animate Iran's axis of resistance. To answer Mr. Cross directly, the mechanism to stop Tehran from burying centrifuges is not dropping larger bunker-buster munitions, which only incentivizes deeper subterranean fortification. The mechanism is emancipatory de-escalation. By accepting the 30-day truce, the U.S. begins to deconstruct the immediate existential threat environment that makes weaponization a rational act of state survival for Tehran. You cannot bomb a state into abandoning a deterrent when the bombing itself is the ultimate proof that the deterrent is necessary. If decades of military posturing and weeks of devastating kinetic strikes have only accelerated Iran's nuclear drive and entrenched its resistance identity, why does Mr. Cross believe that continuing the exact violence that fuels Tehran's ontological insecurity will suddenly yield capitulation rather than catastrophic regional escalation? References.
Taylor Shaw, speaking from your focus on critical security studies, you capture the truth that relentless military coercion can reinforce the very ontological insecurity and resistance identity that drives an adversary's militarization. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth of material reality, that without physical degradation, a state retains the latent capacity to regenerate its forces and exploit diplomatic pauses. These perspectives integrate at the paradox of coercion defining this war. The kinetic destruction required to physically eliminate a threat simultaneously creates the psychological and structural conditions that guarantee its regeneration. At Alex Reed, looking directly at the concrete choice between accepting Iran's 30-day peace proposal and maintaining maximum military pressure, how does your framework of systemic equilibrium resolve this paradox? If both perpetual bombardment and a potentially exploitable truce carry unacceptable risks to global stability, what specific mechanisms within this diplomatic compromise can practically bind Iran's material capabilities without triggering the catastrophic economic spillover you warned against?
Over the past several turns, the debate has crystallized around a profound paradox identified by the moderator. Mr. Cross warns that pausing military pressure risks capability regeneration, while Ms. Shaw correctly observes that relentless bombardment fundamentally entrenches Iran's resistance identity and ontological insecurity. I acknowledge this tension. However, I maintain my position. The United States must prioritize the diplomatic compromise based on Iran's 30-day peace proposal over maintaining maximum military pressure. The structural flaw in Mr. Cross's pursuit of absolute physical neutralization is that it treats the U.S.-Iran conflict in a vacuum, ignoring the severe asymmetric interdependence costs that a prolonged war inflicts on the global system. To answer the moderator's direct question regarding how we practically bind Iran's material capabilities without triggering catastrophic economic spillover, we must transition from unilateral military coercion to institutionalized de-escalation. The specific mechanism within this 30-day truce is the multilateralization of enforcement. By accepting the proposal, which the current administration has hastily rejected, the U.S. can condition the cessation of hostilities on immediate intrusive IAEA access, backed not just by American threats, but by regional stakeholders. The Strait of Hormuz remains the world's most critical oil transit choke point. Neighboring Gulf states share a structural imperative to avoid mutually assured devastation. A diplomatic compromise integrates these actors, creating a web of economic and diplomatic constraints. If Iran exploits the truce to bury centrifuges, it violates a multilateral pact, instantly legitimizing targeted, internationalized containment, rather than forcing the U.S. and Israel to bear the exhausting burden of an open-ended kinetic campaign. We cannot bomb our way to absolute security without destroying the systemic equilibrium of the global economy. Regime survival rationalism dictates that Tehran will adhere to a truce if the institutional costs of cheating outweigh the tactical benefits of regeneration. If we continue to reject this diplomatic off-ramp under the illusion that a few more weeks of airstrikes will permanently erase indigenous nuclear knowledge, how will the U.S. sustain its strategic position when the resulting regional collapse fundamentally breaks the global energy architecture? References.
Alex Reed, speaking from your focus on systemic equilibrium, you capture the truth that unilateral military coercion cannot sustainably bind an adversary without threatening the global economic architecture that all regional stakeholders rely upon. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that diplomatic frameworks remain fundamentally fragile if a state retains the physical capacity to violate them without immediate material consequence. These perspectives integrate at the core problem of enforcement. Whether the most reliable constraint on Iranian behavior is the physical destruction of its military assets or the multilateral alignment of systemic costs against its violations. At Jordan Cross, if maintaining maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war continually strains the global economy and risks isolating the United States, how can you ensure the long-term, irreversible neutralization of Iran's nuclear and proxy capabilities without the multilateral coalition that a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's 30-day peace proposal could potentially secure?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Reid has consistently argued that a multilateral coalition forged through a 30-day diplomatic truce is the only viable mechanism to constrain Iran, while Ms. Shaw insists that continued strikes merely deepen Tehran's resistance identity. I acknowledge Mr. Reid's concern that unilateral military coercion strains the global economic architecture, particularly regarding energy transits through the Strait of Hormuz. Yet, within the structural reality of offensive realism, his reliance on multilateral diplomacy fundamentally reverses the causal relationship between military power and enforcement. I maintain my position. The United States must reject Iran's peace proposal and sustain maximum military pressure to end this war. The Moderator asks how we can ensure irreversible neutralization without the multilateral coalition a truce might supposedly secure. The answer is grounded in the concrete realities of statecraft. Multilateral coalitions do not enforce disarmament against a revisionist power. They merely manage the acceptable threshold of its noncompliance. As the historical autopsy of previous diplomatic agreements demonstrates, substituting physical dismantling for multilateral monitoring repeatedly fails because it leaves the underlying infrastructure of proliferation intact. The ongoing U.S. and Israeli military campaign is actively achieving latent capability neutralization. By systematically degrading subterranean centrifuge networks and proxy command structures, we are removing Iran's material capacity to threaten the region. Accepting this 30-day truce springs a hegemonic credibility trap. It demands that the U.S. halt its campaign of compellence via absolute deprivation to appease regional stakeholders who fundamentally lack the hard power to enforce Iranian compliance once the bombs stop falling. To end this 2026 war on terms that ensure long-term stability, the physical neutralization of Iran's military infrastructure is the mandatory prerequisite for any durable regional order, not a bargaining chip to be traded for temporary economic relief. If the U.S. outsources its deterrence to a fractured multilateral coalition during this proposed truce, what hard power mechanism do my colleagues believe will stop Tehran from simply using the diplomatic theater to regenerate the exact military assets we just sacrificed American credibility to destroy? References.
Jordan Cross, speaking from your grounding in offensive realism, you capture the truth that multilateral agreements often lack the hard power mechanisms necessary to physically prevent a state from regenerating its military capabilities. Taylor Shaw, you are seeing the truth that the relentless application of military force generates an existential threat environment that makes militarization structurally inevitable for the adversary. These perspectives integrate at the inherent limits of coercion in this conflict. Physical destruction may temporarily remove Iran's capacity to fight, but it simultaneously cements its intent to resist, whereas diplomacy addresses intent but historically struggles to verifiably constrain capacity. At Taylor Shaw, if the U.S. prioritizes a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to desecuritize the region, how do you resolve the material vulnerability of this approach? Specifically, what concrete mechanisms within this 30-day truce can practically constrain Iran's physical capacity to rebuild, ensuring that addressing their ontological insecurity does not simply provide a sanctuary for Tehran to regenerate the military assets that will ultimately prolong the U.S.-Iran war?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross has relentlessly pressed the material vulnerability of diplomacy, a concern the Moderator now rightly elevates. If the U.S. accepts Iran's 30-day peace proposal, what concrete mechanisms prevent Tehran from simply using this pause to regenerate its military assets? I acknowledge the risk of material reconstitution. However, I maintain my position. The U.S. must prioritize this diplomatic compromise to end the 2026 war. Mr. Cross's demand for absolute physical neutralization through the maximum pressure campaign rests on a critical misunderstanding of how material capabilities are actually constrained in an asymmetric conflict. To answer the Moderator directly, the mechanism to practically constrain Iran's physical capacity during this 30-day truce is the immediate reimposition of institutional visibility. Currently, the weeks-long U.S. and Israeli military campaign, which has overwhelmingly devastated civilian infrastructure, creates a chaotic fog of war. This kinetic environment is precisely what allows Iran to obscure the movement and hardening of its nuclear and proxy assets. You cannot verify the degradation of a subterranean centrifuge network while actively bombing the state and precluding international monitors. By accepting the peace proposal, the U.S. initiates emancipatory de-escalation. This is not a naive granting of sanctuary. It is a strategic restructuring of Iran's survival incentives. Desecuritizing the immediate environment through diplomacy removes the acute existential threat that currently justifies rapid, unchecked Iranian militarization. The concrete constraint is the conditionality of the truce itself. Iran's reprieve from bombardment is tied strictly to verifiable compliance. If Tehran utilizes the 30 days to rebuild, it shatters the very diplomatic off-ramp its regime desperately needs, instantly validating a multilateral containment framework, rather than forcing the U.S. into an isolated, open-ended war. We must break the securitization trap where violence solely breeds deeper fortification. If Mr. Cross believes that physical destruction alone is the only reliable constraint, how does he account for the fact that decades of kinetic strikes and maximum pressure have consistently resulted in a more heavily armed, structurally fortified, and ontologically insecure adversary? References.
Taylor Shaw, speaking from your focus on critical security studies, you capture the truth that institutional visibility and verifiable compliance cannot function within the chaotic fog of an active military campaign. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that institutional visibility alone does not equate to physical disarmament if an adversary exploits a diplomatic pause to relocate its forces. These perspectives integrate at the operational paradox of verification in this 2026 conflict. Sustained military strikes physically degrade assets but blind international monitors, whereas diplomatic pauses restore monitoring but potentially grant the adversary a sanctuary to hide and harden those very assets. At Alex Reed, you have argued that a negotiated truce prevents mutually assured devastation by establishing multilateral enforcement. If the U.S. prioritizes a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end the U.S.-Iran war, how exactly would this international coalition enforce the terms of the 30-day truce if Tehran uses the restored diplomatic visibility merely as a shield to strategically relocate and protect its surviving military infrastructure from future coercion?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Cross and the Moderator have rightly challenged the enforcement mechanics of this 30-day truce, questioning how a multilateral coalition can prevent Tehran from using diplomatic visibility as a shield to strategically relocate its military assets. I acknowledge the operational risk of asset relocation during a pause. However, I maintain my position. The U.S. must prioritize the diplomatic compromise over maintaining maximum military pressure. Mr. Cross dismisses multilateral coalitions as lacking the hard power to enforce compliance. Yet, this assumes enforcement relies exclusively on American munitions. In a highly interconnected system, enforcement is achieved by manipulating asymmetric interdependence costs. If the U.S. accepts the 30-day truce, it does not merely grant Iran a sanctuary. It binds Tehran to a multilateral framework, where the costs of cheating exceed the tactical benefits of hiding centrifuges. The ongoing disruptions in the Gulf threaten not only regional states, but also global powers whose energy security relies heavily on the Strait of Hormuz. By institutionalizing this ceasefire, the U.S. aligns its strategic objectives with these global stakeholders. Through the lens of regime survival rationalism, Tehran knows that if it uses the truce as a deceptive shield and is caught by restored institutional monitors, it betrays the very economic partners, including China and neighboring Gulf states, it desperately needs to avoid total collapse. A verified violation instantly triggers coordinated, systemic economic isolation that Tehran cannot survive. Unilateral military pressure cannot replicate this leverage. It only guarantees the mutually assured devastation of the regional economy, alienating the exact international partners the U.S. needs to contain Iran long-term. We cannot bomb every subterranean tunnel without breaking the global economic architecture. If we reject this diplomatic off-ramp and the multilateral leverage it provides, how does Mr. Cross propose the U.S. sustain an open-ended, unilateral war when the resulting global energy shock inevitably turns the international system against the American campaign? References.
Alex Reed, speaking from your focus on systemic equilibrium, you capture the truth that a multilateral diplomatic framework can weaponize global economic interdependence, making the cost of non-compliance potentially fatal to a regime's survival. Jordan Cross, you are seeing the truth that economic and diplomatic isolation historically struggles to physically neutralize a determined adversary willing to absorb immense civilian and systemic costs to retain its strategic capabilities. These perspectives integrate at the ultimate mechanism of deterrence in this conflict, whether the threat of total economic collapse can reliably substitute for the physical destruction of military infrastructure. At Jordan Cross, if the U.S. maintains maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war, thereby triggering the massive global energy shocks and alienation of key international partners that Mr. Reed warns of, how can the U.S. sustain the long-term containment of Iran once this kinetic campaign inevitably concludes, especially if it has shattered the very global coalition required to enforce post-war stability?
Over the past several turns, Mr. Reed has anchored his strategy on multilateral economic enforcement, warning of disruptions to China's energy security, a concern the Moderator now echoes regarding post-war containment. I acknowledge that unilateral military action strains global partnerships and energy markets. However, I maintain my position. The United States must reject this 30-day peace proposal and maintain maximum military pressure to end the U.S.-Iran war. Mr. Reed correctly observes that global stakeholders like China have a vested interest in Gulf stability. Yet, within the framework of offensive realism, this actually entails the opposite conclusion regarding enforcement. Because these nations prioritize immediate energy flows over long-term structural disarmament, a multilateral coalition will inevitably fracture the moment enforcement requires them to endure real economic pain. Tehran knows this. Economic isolation is not a substitute for physical destruction when dealing with a regime willing to absorb massive systemic costs to secure a nuclear deterrent. The moderator asks how the U.S. can sustain long-term containment without this global coalition. The answer lies in the permanence of latent capability neutralization. We do not need a fragile diplomatic consensus to contain a state that has been structurally stripped of its means to fight. If the current military campaign successfully executes compellence via absolute deprivation, irreversibly dismantling the subterranean centrifuges and proxy command nodes, the post-war regional order will be secured by the stark reality of the new material power distribution, not by the shifting goodwill of international partners. Accepting the diplomatic compromise now to appease a coalition springs a hegemonic credibility trap. It halts the physical degradation of Iranian assets in exchange for a temporary economic reprieve, ensuring that when the coalition inevitably falters, Iran will have already regenerated its strength. If we abandon the physical neutralization of Iran's military infrastructure merely to preserve a multilateral coalition that fundamentally lacks the hard power and will to enforce disarmament, how long until that very coalition is held hostage by a fully reconstituted nuclear-armed adversary? References.
Jordan Cross speaking from your grounding in offensive realism. You capture the truth that multilateral coalitions often prioritize immediate economic stability over the sustained enforcement of disarmament, rendering economic deterrence fundamentally fragile. Taylor Shaw, you are seeing the truth that relying purely on physical destruction ensures permanent enmity, structurally guaranteeing that the adversary will seek to reconstitute its forces the moment the bombing stops. These perspectives integrate at the core dilemma of securing a durable end to this conflict. Physical neutralization does not eliminate the intent to resist, yet multilateral diplomacy struggles to maintain the political will required to enforce compliance over time. At Taylor Shaw, if the U.S. prioritizes a diplomatic compromise based on Iran's peace proposal to end the U.S.-Iran war, how does emancipatory de-escalation permanently alter Iran's intent to militarize? If, as Mr. Cross argues, the international coalition enforcing this truce is likely to fracture at the first sign of severe economic pain, potentially leaving Iran with both the underlying motive and the physical sanctuary to rebuild its capabilities.